I remember the exact moment the room went quiet. Frank Harper. My fiancé's father, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant with 40 years of pride in his voice, was halfway through explaining to me how the Marine Corps really worked. He had one elbow on the dining table, his fork resting on a half-eaten piece of roast chicken, and he was talking slowly the way people do when they think the person across from them just doesn't understand. And that's the problem with civilians, he said. They read a few headlines, maybe watch a war movie and think they understand what command means. But leadership in the Corps, that's something you earn. It's not something that gets handed to you. The table went quiet after that. Daniel shifted in his chair beside me. Margaret Harper looked down at her plate. Frank took a sip of iced tea, satisfied with his own speech. And I folded my napkin neatly in my lap, met his eyes across the table, and said very calmly, "Frank, I actually do understand command. I'm the new Marine general assigned to your base." For a moment, no one moved. Not even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick. Frank Harper's face turned the color of old parchment. But to understand how we ended up in that moment, how a simple Sunday dinner in coastal North Carolina turned into the most uncomfortable family revelation of Frank Harper's life, you have to start a little earlier. About 2 weeks earlier, to be exact. I had just taken command of the Marine installation outside Jacksonville, North Carolina. The paperwork still smelled fresh. My name had barely settled into the brass plate outside the office. Command transitions are formal things in the Marine Corps ceremony, handshakes, speeches, the band playing the hymn. But once the ceremony ends, the work begins immediately. And command is quieter than people imagine. It's long days, decisions that follow you home, names of young Marines you learn because you're responsible for them. At 52 years old, after 3 decades in uniform, I understood that responsibility better than most. What I hadn't expected was how complicated my personal life would become at the exact same moment. Because 2 months before that command ceremony, Daniel Harper had asked me to marry him. Daniel wasn't a Marine. He was a civilian contractor who worked in logistics systems for the Department of Defense. Practical, thoughtful, patient. The kind of man who listened more than he talked, which is rarer than people think. We met 3 years earlier during a readiness project in Virginia. He knew what I did. He knew my rank. But outside work, we rarely talked about the details of my career. Not because it was secret, nothing like that. It was just easier to be Elaine when I wasn't wearing the uniform. And Daniel understood that. One evening, about a week after I officially arrived in North Carolina, Daniel came over to my small rental house near the base carrying 2 grocery bags and that slightly nervous smile he gets when he's about to ask for something. We cooked dinner together, the windows open to the warm coastal air, cicadas humming outside. Halfway through the meal, he cleared his throat. "My parents want to meet you." I smiled. That sounds reasonable. He nodded slowly but didn't quite meet my eyes. "There's just one thing." I leaned back in my chair. "Whenever someone says that it's never a small thing." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "My dad's a retired Marine, gunnery sergeant, Vietnam era." I waited. "And he's traditional." "Traditional how?" Daniel exhaled. "He believes the Corps has changed too much. He thinks leadership today is softer, too political." "That's not unusual," I said calmly. "Yeah, but there's more," he hesitated. "He also struggles with women in command roles." I didn't react immediately. After 30 years in the Marine Corps, that particular attitude wasn't exactly new territory. Daniel rushed to continue. "He's not a bad man, Elaine. He's just from a different time. Proud, opinionated, the Corps meant everything to him." "I understand that," I said. "And he doesn't know your rank." That made me raise an eyebrow. "What does he think I do?" Daniel gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I might have told him you're a consultant working on logistics systems." I stared at him. "You told your father I was basically a contractor." I panicked, he admitted. "You panicked for 3 years." He winced. "Okay, maybe I kept panicking." I couldn't help smiling a little. "Why?" Daniel looked genuinely sheepish. "Because I knew the second he heard Marine General, the conversation would stop being about you and start being about rank, and I wanted him to meet you first." That answer softened me more than he probably realized. Still, I asked the practical question. "And now?" "Well, he invited us to Sunday dinner." I sipped my coffee and thought about it. In the Marine Corps, I'd spent my entire career being introduced by rank first. Sometimes it was necessary, sometimes it was exhausting. Meeting Daniel's family as just Elaine sounded almost refreshing. Finally, I nodded. All right. Daniel blinked. All right. I'll come to dinner. You're sure? Daniel, I said with a small smile. I've briefed combat commanders and testified before congressional committees. I think I can survive Sunday dinner. He laughed with relief. But before the evening ended, he said something that lingered with me. Just one thing he added carefully. My dad likes to talk about the Marine Corps. I'd expect that. And he can be a little intense. I smiled again. That's fine. At the time, I truly believed it would be. What I didn't realize was just how intense Frank Harper could be when he believed he was protecting the honor of the Marine Corps. Or how quiet a dining room can become when a man suddenly realizes the person he's been lecturing all evening is the highest-ranking Marine he's spoken to in decades. The drive to Daniel's parents' house took about 30 minutes. Late Sunday afternoon light stretched across the coastal highway, turning the pine trees gold at the edges. North Carolina has a way of feeling both slow and steady at the same time. Small towns, church steeples, gas stations that still sell boiled peanuts at the counter. Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel, quiet in the way people get when they're thinking too much. I watched the road for a while before saying, "You're nervous." He gave a small laugh. Is it that obvious? A little. I just want it to go well, he said. That's reasonable. He glanced over at me briefly. My dad can come off strong. I've met strong personalities before. That's not exactly what I mean. I let him take his time. He believes the Marine Corps is the most important institution in the country, Daniel continued. He believes discipline solves almost every problem, and he believes people should prove themselves before they speak. Sounds like a Marine gunnery sergeant, I said calmly. Daniel smiled at that. Yeah, exactly. We turned onto a quiet residential street lined with modest ranch-style homes. Most of them had American flags out front. A few had Marine Corps flags, too. Frank Harper's house stood near the end of the block. White siding, neatly trimmed lawn, a flagpole in the yard with the stars and stripes flying above a faded red Marine Corps banner. Daniel parked in the driveway but didn't shut off the engine right away. You don't have to do this, he said. I said I would. I just mean if he starts getting intense. I turned toward him. Daniel. Yeah. I'm a Marine. He laughed softly and finally turned off the engine. Frank Harper opened the door before we even reached the porch. He was taller than I expected for a man in his 70s. Broad shoulders, straight posture, silver hair cut short like he'd left the Corps yesterday. Even out of uniform, you could see the habits of military bearing in the way he stood. Danny, he said, gripping his son's hand with a firm shake. Good to see you, Dad. Frank's eyes shifted to me. He studied me the way Marines sometimes study new recruits, quickly, quietly assessing. You must be Elaine. That's right, I said. His handshake was firm but brief. Frank Harper. Nice to meet you. Behind him, a woman appeared in the hallway. Margaret Harper was smaller, soft-spoken, with warm eyes, and the calm patience of someone who had spent decades balancing a strong-willed husband. You finally brought her, she said to Daniel with a smile. Margaret hugged her son, then turned to me. Welcome, Elaine. Come in. The house smelled like roasted chicken and fresh cornbread. I noticed the details immediately. Framed photographs along the hallway wall. A younger Frank Harper in dress blues. Black and white photos of Marines standing in dusty airfields decades ago. A folded American flag in a glass case. A shadow box filled with ribbons, medals, and old rank insignia. Frank noticed me looking. Vietnam, he said simply. I nodded. Thank you for your service. He gave a small grunt that might have been approval. We moved into the dining room where the table was already set. Margaret brought out iced tea glasses while Daniel helped carry dishes from the kitchen. Frank sat at the head of the table. I sat across from him. From the beginning, the questions started. Not rude exactly, but probing. So Frank said, leaning back slightly, Daniel tells me you work with defense logistics. That's right. What kind of work? Coordination mostly, systems planning. He nodded slowly. Civilian side? Yes. Frank took a sip of tea. Well, that's important work. The military runs on logistics. That's true. Most people don't realize that. Daniel shot me a quick glance. I kept my expression neutral. Frank continued. Back in my day, we used to say amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. That's still true today, I said. He seemed pleased by that answer. Margaret brought the food out, then roast chicken mashed potatoes, green beans cooked with bacon. The kind of meal that belongs to Sunday evenings in America. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed pleasant. Margaret asked about where I grew up. Ohio. Daniel mentioned a fishing trip we'd taken last fall. Frank talked about the town and how much it had changed since the 70s. But slowly, the conversation turned back toward the Marine Corps. It almost always does when Marines gather. Frank began telling stories from his service. Some of them were fascinating. Training exercises in the desert. Young Marines learning discipline the hard way. Long deployments where the only thing keeping people steady was the chain of command. As he spoke, I could hear the pride in his voice. But there was something else there, too. A certain bitterness about how things had changed. You see, he said at one point, gesturing slightly with his fork, the Corps used to be simpler. Daniel shifted in his seat. Frank continued. You knew who the leaders were. You knew who'd earned their place. Margaret gave him a look. Frank. What he said. I'm just talking. He turned back to me. Problem today is everybody wants authority, but fewer people understand responsibility. I nodded politely. That's a challenge in any organization. Frank leaned forward slightly. Let me ask you something, Elaine. All right. You ever worked around Marines directly? Sometimes. Well then, you know he said that command isn't about titles, it's about respect. He spoke slowly like he was explaining something important to a student. Respect has to be earned. I agree, I said. Daniel cleared his throat. Dad. But Frank wasn't finished. You see a lot of civilians these days thinking they understand military life, he said. Frank, Margaret said gently. I'm just saying he insisted. People talk about command like it's just another management job. His eyes settled on me again. But leadership in the Corps, he said, that's different. I waited. Frank leaned back in his chair, completely certain of himself. And most folks outside the uniform don't really understand it. The room grew a little quieter after that. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Margaret focused on her plate. Frank, meanwhile, seemed satisfied with his point. And I realized something in that moment. Frank Harper wasn't trying to insult me personally. He was defending an idea of the Marine Corps that had shaped his entire life. But he had already decided who I was. Just some woman dating his son. Someone who couldn't possibly understand command. And the evening was only halfway finished. Frank Harper finished his sentence with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent most of his life being the most experienced person in the room. And most folks outside the uniform don't really understand it. He took another bite of chicken and looked satisfied with that thought. For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret passed the green beans down the table. Daniel cleared his throat. I took a sip of iced tea and set the glass down carefully. I imagine that's been your experience, I said calmly. Frank nodded once. 30 years around Marines, he said. You learn a few things. I believed him. People sometimes assume pride and arrogance are the same thing. They aren't. Pride usually comes from something real years of work, sacrifice, discipline. But if you hold on to it too tightly, it can slowly harden into certainty. And certainty, in my experience, is where good judgment sometimes starts to slip. Frank set his fork down. So what exactly do you do in logistics planning, he asked. Mostly coordination between departments, I said. Personnel movement, supply, readiness, infrastructure planning. Sounds complicated. It can be. He leaned forward slightly. You ever been on a base during a deployment cycle? Yes. Well then you know how chaotic it gets. I do. Frank seemed to enjoy the role he had taken on teacher guide elder Marine explaining the world. You get young officers fresh out of school. He continued thinking they understand leadership because they read a few manuals. Daniel shifted again. Dad. Frank waved him off. No, this is important. Leadership in the Corps isn't theory. His eyes landed on me again. It's experience. Time in the field. Making decisions when things go wrong. I agree, I said quietly. Margaret gave me a small sympathetic smile from across the table. Frank continued eating while he spoke. These days, you see a lot of people climbing the ladder without really earning it. Daniel sighed softly. Dad, maybe we could talk about something else. Frank frowned slightly. What? I'm just explaining how the system works. Elaine didn't come here for a lecture. I'm not lecturing, Frank insisted. Then he turned back to me again. But it's good for civilians to understand what military leadership actually requires. I could feel Daniel tense beside me. But I stayed relaxed. Frank, I said gently, I appreciate the insight. That seemed to encourage him. Well, let me give you an example. Margaret closed her eyes briefly the way someone does when they know a storm is coming. Frank leaned back in his chair and began describing a training exercise from the early 70s. Young Marines under pressure. Command decisions made in seconds. Mistakes that could cost lives. The story itself wasn't exaggerated. I had heard similar ones before from men of his generation. But as he spoke, his tone slowly shifted. It moved from storytelling into something else. Instruction. See, he said, pointing slightly with his fork, command isn't about being smart. Plenty of smart people fail. That's true, I said. It's about judgment, character, the kind of backbone you only build through experience. Daniel rubbed his temple. Margaret focused very carefully on cutting her chicken. Frank continued. You've got to know how Marines think, how they react under pressure. He paused, looking at me. That's not something you pick up from spreadsheets. No, I agreed. He nodded, satisfied. Exactly. There was another short silence. Then Frank added something that changed the air in the room. The trouble nowadays is people think leadership can be taught in classrooms. Daniel spoke quickly. Dad. Frank ignored him. They hand out rank like it's just another promotion. Margaret finally spoke. Frank, that's enough. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. He looked at me again. No offense. I smiled faintly. None taken. But Daniel had had enough. Dad, he said firmly, Elaine understands the military better than you think. Frank raised an eyebrow. Oh, yes. Frank leaned forward slightly. How so? Daniel hesitated. Because Daniel knew exactly how so. But the moment hadn't come yet. So he simply said, she's worked around it for years. Frank gave a skeptical grunt. Well, working around it isn't the same as living it. I let that pass. Margaret tried again to redirect the conversation. Elaine, Daniel said you grew up in Ohio. Yes, small town outside Dayton. Military family. My father was Air Force. Frank perked up slightly. Oh yeah. Maintenance officer. He nodded. Good branch. For a moment the tension eased. But Frank wasn't finished with the topic that mattered most to him. After a few more minutes he returned to it again. You know, he said the Marine Corps has always been about earned authority. No one interrupted him this time. You don't get respect just because someone gives you a title. He spoke slowly, deliberately. You earn it from the Marines under you. I nodded once. That's true, Frank continued. And the best commanders are the ones who understand the weight of that responsibility. His voice softened slightly. When young Marines look to you for direction, that's not a management problem. He tapped the table lightly with his finger. That's leadership. Then he looked directly at me again. And most people outside the Corps never really see that side of things. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. I folded my napkin beside my plate. Frank took another sip of tea. And that's why he said command is something you earn every day. The room fell quiet again. Margaret looked at me carefully. Daniel shifted in his chair. And I realized something important. Frank Harper wasn't trying to be cruel. He simply believed he was speaking to someone who couldn't possibly understand what he was talking about. And the longer he talked, the deeper he stepped into that assumption. Finally, I placed my hands lightly on the table. Frank, I said calmly. Yes. You're absolutely right. He seemed pleased by that. Yes. I met his eyes. A person in command does have to earn that title every day. Frank nodded once. Exactly. Then I continued. That's something I've learned over 30 years in the Marine Corps. Frank blinked. Just once. Then I added quietly, and I'll be responsible for earning it here, as the new Marine General assigned to your base. The room stopped breathing. Daniel froze beside me. Margaret's fork slipped against her plate, And Frank Harper stared at me like a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet had been something else entirely. Frank Harper didn't move. Not right away. His eyes stayed fixed on me across the dinner table as if he were waiting for the punchline to arrive. The kind of pause people make when they assume they've misunderstood something simple. "You're what?" he asked slowly. His voice had lost the certainty it carried 10 seconds earlier. I kept my tone calm. "I'm Major General Elaine Mercer," I said. "United States Marine Corps. I took command of the installation last week." No one reached for their food. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Frank blinked again. Daniel shifted beside me. Margaret looked between the two of us like she was trying to put together a puzzle that suddenly had new pieces. Frank leaned back slightly in his chair. "General," he repeated. "Yes." His eyes narrowed. Now he was studying me again, but this time not as a curious father meeting his son's girlfriend. Now he was searching for something else. Proof. Doubt. Any sign that I might be exaggerating. "That's a pretty big claim," he said carefully. "It is." Frank set his fork down. "You're telling me you're the new commanding general at Lejeune?" "Yes." He stared for another long moment. Then he gave a short laugh that didn't quite land. "Come on now." Daniel finally spoke. "Dad." Frank held up a hand. "Danny, hold on." His eyes stayed on me. "You're serious." "I am." Margaret spoke softly. "Frank." But Frank was already running through possibilities in his head. Retired Marines develop a certain instinct over time. They read posture tone details. And I could see the moment his instincts started noticing things he'd overlooked earlier. The way I sat. The way I spoke. The questions I'd asked earlier about base readiness. Frank leaned forward again. "If you're a Marine general," he said slowly, "then you'd know the name of the current operations deputy." "I replaced General Wallace," I said calmly. "Colonel Rivera is still acting deputy until the transition review is finished next month." Frank's jaw tightened. That answer landed exactly where it should have. He tried again. "And the readiness inspection scheduled for October." "Moved up 2 weeks," I said. "Logistics backlog from the last rotation." Margaret inhaled quietly. Frank's fingers tightened slightly on the table. Another long silence passed. Then Frank sat back in his chair again. And for the first time all evening, the certainty was gone from his face. He looked embarrassed. Not angry. Not defensive. Just stunned. Daniel finally spoke again. "Dad, she told you." Frank rubbed a hand slowly across his mouth. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. Margaret looked at me with wide eyes. "You're really the general?" she asked gently. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret leaned back slightly, absorbing that. Then she looked at her husband. Frank was staring at the table now. The man who had spent the last half hour explaining Marine leadership to me now had nothing to say. I could see what was happening behind his eyes. Every sentence he had spoken earlier was replaying itself in his memory. The lecture. The explanations. The quiet assumption that I didn't understand command. Frank finally cleared his throat. "Well, that's something." No one laughed. Daniel tried to ease the moment. "Dad didn't know," he said. Frank shot him a look. I gathered that. He turned back toward me slowly. "You didn't think to mention that earlier." "I wanted to meet you as Daniel's fiancé," I said calmly, "not as a rank." That answer seemed to hit him harder than anything else. Frank nodded slowly. "Right." He picked up his glass of iced tea and took a long drink. Margaret finally broke the silence. "Well," she said softly, "that certainly explains why you were so patient." Frank looked up at her. "Patient." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You spent 30 minutes explaining Marine leadership to her." Frank winced slightly. Daniel coughed into his hand to hide a laugh. Frank gave him a sharp look. "Don't." Then Frank looked back at me. "I suppose I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "Yes, I do." He sat straighter in his chair. "I made assumptions." "That happens." Frank shook his head slowly. "No, what happened was I talked down to someone who outranks every officer I ever served under." I shook my head slightly. "Frank, rank isn't the point. It is when you spend half an hour explaining the Marine Corps to a general." Daniel couldn't hold back a quiet chuckle. Frank shot him another glare. "Danny." "Sorry." Margaret reached across the table and touched Frank's arm. "Frank, breathe." He sighed. Then he looked at me again. "You really just took command." "Last week." He let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be." Another pause settled over the table. But this one felt different. Less tense. More reflective. Frank shook his head slowly. "I've spent 40 years thinking I could read people." I said nothing. "And tonight I completely misread the highest-ranking Marine I've talked to in decades." I gave a small smile. "You weren't the first person to underestimate me." Frank nodded once. "I imagine not." Margaret smiled faintly. "Well, she said next time someone comes to dinner, maybe we ask fewer questions." Frank looked at her. "That's not how Marines work." But there was a hint of humor in his voice now. Daniel leaned back in his chair with relief. "See," he said quietly to me, "not a disaster." I looked at Frank again. "No," I said softly. But Frank Harper was still thinking. And I could see that the realization hadn't finished settling yet. Because what embarrassed him most wasn't the rank. It was the fact that he had assumed I didn't belong in the world he loved most. And Marines more than anyone hate realizing they judged another Marine too quickly. Dinner ended more quietly than it had begun. Margaret cleared the plates while Daniel helped carry dishes into the kitchen. Frank offered once or twice, but Margaret waved him away. I suspected she knew her husband needed a moment alone with his thoughts. I stepped out onto the back porch while the kitchen filled with the soft clatter of dishes and running water. The evening air had cooled. Somewhere down the street a dog barked, and the faint sound of a baseball game drifted from a neighbor's television. The sky over the pine trees had turned that deep Carolina blue that always arrives just before night. For a few minutes I just stood there letting the quiet settle. 30 years in the Marine Corps teaches you that after a confrontation, silence can be useful. People need time to let their pride loosen its grip. The porch door creaked behind me. Daniel stepped out. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine." He leaned against the railing beside me and let out a long breath. "Well," he said, "that escalated." I smiled faintly. "A little. I'm really sorry about my dad." "You don't need to apologize." "Yes, I do. I should have told him earlier." "That might not have helped." Daniel frowned. "You think he would have acted the same way?" "Probably not," I said. "But then he wouldn't have shown us who he really is either." Daniel considered that. "He's not a bad man," he said quietly. "I know. But he's stubborn. So are most Marines." Daniel laughed softly. "That's true." We stood there for another minute before the porch door opened again. Frank stepped outside. He looked different now. The certainty that had filled the dining room earlier had softened into something else, something more careful. "Daniel," he said. "Yeah." "Could you give us a minute?" Daniel glanced between us. "You sure?" "I'll survive," I said. Daniel nodded and slipped back inside. Frank walked slowly to the other side of the porch railing. For a while he just stared out at the darkening yard. Then he cleared his throat. "Well, he said that was a hell of a dinner." I smiled slightly. "Yes, it was." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You know, I've replayed that conversation in my head about 10 times in the last 15 minutes. That sounds uncomfortable." "It is." Frank shifted his weight. "I spent half the evening explaining the Marine Corps to someone who commands more Marines than I ever met in my entire career." "That happens sometimes." He shook his head. "No, not usually like that." Another silence passed. Finally, he turned toward me. "I owe you a real apology." "You already offered one." "That one was automatic," he said. "This one's deliberate." I waited. Frank looked me straight in the eye. "I judged you." "Yes." "I assumed you didn't understand the Corps." "Yes." "And I talked down to you in my own house." I nodded once. "That part did happen." He sighed. "You were patient about it." "Patience is useful." Frank studied my face for a moment. "Most people would have corrected me a lot earlier." "Probably." "Why didn't you?" I considered the question carefully. "Because you weren't trying to hurt me," I said. "You were defending something you care about." Frank looked surprised. "You think that's what I was doing?" "Yes." He leaned back against the railing. "You're not wrong." Frank stared out across the yard again. The Marine Corps gave me everything he said quietly. Discipline, direction, pride. When you spend that much of your life inside something like that, you start thinking you know exactly what it looks like. I understood that feeling. And tonight, he continued, I realized the Corps moved forward without asking my permission. That tends to happen. Frank chuckled softly at that. Yeah. He looked at me again. I didn't expect you. In what way? He hesitated. Then he said the honest thing. You're not what I imagined when I heard the words Marine General. I've heard that before. I'm sure you have. Frank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You know what bothered me most tonight? What? It wasn't that you outrank everyone I ever served with. What was it? That you sat there and listened to me talk like an idiot without losing your temper. That's called discipline. Frank nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess it is. Another pause passed. Then he said something I hadn't expected. You love my son. Yes. That's why you came tonight. Yes. He looked down at the porch floor for a moment. Danny's a good man. He is. And if he's chosen you... Frank shook his head slightly. Well, I clearly misjudged the situation. I smiled. That happens to all of us eventually. Frank gave a tired laugh. I just wish mine hadn't happened over roast chicken and mashed potatoes. That's better than it happening during a training exercise. He considered that. Fair point. The porch light flicked on automatically above us as the sky darkened. Frank straightened a little. You know, he said slowly, there's something else I should probably tell you. What's that? I've spent a long time telling younger Marines that respect has to be earned. That's true. Well, he said tonight I learned something new about that. What? Frank met my eyes again. Sometimes respect starts with admitting you were wrong. I nodded once. Yes, it does. And for the first time that evening, Frank Harper looked less like a man defending his past, and more like a Marine ready to learn something new. Frank called me 2 days later. I was in my office at the installation headquarters when my assistant stepped in and said, Ma'am, there's a Mr. Frank Harper on the line. Says it's personal. For a second, I just looked up from the paperwork on my desk. Frank Harper. I hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. Put him through, I said. There was a short click and then Frank's voice came across the line quieter than I remembered. General Mercer. Elaine is fine, I said. He cleared his throat. I suppose it would be under the circumstances. There was a small pause. I won't take much of your time, he continued. I was hoping you might agree to meet me somewhere. What did you have in mind? Well, he said slowly, I thought maybe the base museum, the memorial garden out front. That made sense. Retired Marines tend to think best around the history of the Corps. I can do that, I said. Thank you. We agreed on Thursday afternoon. The museum at Camp Lejeune sits near a small memorial courtyard. Stone walkways. Bronze plaques. Names etched into granite walls. The kind of place where people instinctively lower their voices. Frank was already there when I arrived. He stood near one of the statues, an old bronze Marine in combat gear staring toward the horizon. Frank had his hands clasped behind his back the way Marines stand when they're remembering something serious. When he saw me approach, he straightened immediately. Old habits never fade. General, he said. Elaine, I reminded him gently. He nodded. Right. For a moment, we both looked toward the memorial wall. You served in Vietnam, I asked. Frank nodded. 71 to 72. That was a hard year. They were all hard years over there. We walked slowly along the path. Frank stopped near a plaque listing the names of Marines from North Carolina who didn't come home. I come here sometimes, he said. I understand. He took a breath. Elaine, I didn't ask you here just to apologize again. All right. I asked you here because I wanted to do it properly. I waited. Frank turned toward me. Sunday night, I behaved like a fool. That's a strong word. It's the right word. He didn't look away as he said it. I spent decades telling younger Marines that humility is part of leadership. Then the moment I met someone who represented the next generation of leadership, I dismissed her. I stayed quiet. Frank continued. And the worst part wasn't the embarrassment. What was it? The realization that I had been clinging to an old picture of the Corps. He gestured toward the memorial. The Marine Corps, I remember, was full of men who looked like me. I nodded slowly. Times change. They do. Frank sighed. But somewhere along the line I started believing that if things changed too much, maybe what we did back then didn't matter anymore. That's not how history works, I said gently. He looked at me. No. No, the core you served built the foundation the rest of us stand on. Frank seemed to think about that. You really believe that? I do. He nodded slowly. That helps. We continued walking. After a few moments, Frank spoke again. Can I ask you something? Of course. How did you stay so calm Sunday night? I smiled slightly. Training. That's it. Mostly. He shook his head. No, there's more to it than that. All right, I said. Part of it is experience. When you've been in command long enough, you learn that reacting emotionally rarely improves a situation. Frank chuckled. That's not how gunnery sergeants usually operate. I know. He looked thoughtful. You know what surprised me the most? What? That you didn't humiliate me. I wasn't trying to. You could have. Maybe. Frank nodded. And you didn't. We reached a bench overlooking the memorial garden. Frank sat down slowly. I talked with some of the guys from my old veterans group yesterday, he said. Oh. Word travels fast in a small town. I smiled. I imagine it does. Frank rubbed his hands together. One of them said something that stuck with me. What was that? He said the Marine Corps has always adapted. Every generation thinks the next one is doing it wrong. That's a common opinion. Frank nodded. But he also said something else. What? He said if the Corps trusted you with command, then maybe I should too. I sat down beside him. That sounds like a wise friend. He's 91, Frank said. At that age you start listening. We both laughed softly. Then Frank grew serious again. There's one more thing he said. What's that? My son. Yes. He loves you. Yes, he does. And if you're willing to put up with his stubborn old father... He paused. I'd like the chance to start over. I studied him for a moment. What would starting over look like? Frank thought about that. Well, he said, for starters, I'd like to invite you back to dinner. I raised an eyebrow. That's brave. He smiled faintly. This time I promise not to explain the Marine Corps to you. That's probably a good plan. Frank nodded. And maybe he added you could explain a few things to me instead. I stood and offered him my hand. I'd be happy to. Frank shook it firmly. And for the first time since Sunday night, the weight of that awkward dinner felt like it had finally begun to lift. A week later, Daniel and I drove back to his parents' house. The same street. The same flag in the yard. The same white house at the end of the block. But the feeling in the car was completely different. Daniel glanced at me as he turned into the driveway. You sure you want to do this again? I smiled. Daniel, I've deployed to conflict zones. I think I can survive another Sunday dinner. He laughed softly. That's not exactly the same thing. No, I said, this one matters more. He raised an eyebrow at that. More? Family always does. Daniel nodded slowly and turned off the engine. For a moment we sat there quietly. Then he reached over and squeezed my hand. Thank you, he said. For what? For giving my dad another chance. I looked at the Marine Corps flag moving gently in the breeze. Everyone deserves one. Frank opened the door again. But this time he didn't stand stiffly in the doorway studying me. Instead, he stepped forward immediately. Elaine, he said. And before I could even respond, he extended his hand. Not the quick handshake from the first dinner. This one was steady. Respectful. Good to see you again. It's good to see you too, Frank. Daniel stepped past us into the house. Margaret appeared in the hallway just like before, though this time she was already smiling. Well, she said warmly, this looks much more promising than last Sunday. Frank gave a quiet grunt. Let's not relive that too many times. Margaret laughed. I plan to bring it up for at least the next 10 years. We all moved into the dining room again. The table looked familiar: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. Frank noticed me glancing at the food. Margaret insisted on the same meal, he said. Why? Daniel asked. Margaret set down a bowl of cornbread. Because if we're going to rewrite the memory, we might as well start from the same place. I smiled. That's a thoughtful strategy. Frank pulled out my chair before sitting down himself. A small gesture. but an intentional one. Dinner began quietly at first. Margaret asked about my week on base. Daniel talked about a project he was finishing. Frank mostly listened. Halfway through the meal, he finally cleared his throat. "Before we go any further," he said. Daniel looked up. Margaret paused. Frank looked directly at me. "I'd like to say something." The room went still. Frank placed his hands flat on the table. "Last Sunday I made a mistake." No one interrupted. "I judged Elaine before I knew her." He glanced at me briefly. "I assumed things about her experience, about her understanding of the core." He looked at Daniel. "And I embarrassed myself in the process." Daniel opened his mouth to say something, but Frank shook his head. "Let me finish." He turned back to me. "The Marine Corps taught me that respect is something you earn." I nodded slightly. "But what I forgot," Frank continued, "is that respect also starts with listening." Margaret gave him a small, approving smile. Frank continued. "I spent years telling younger Marines not to underestimate people." He paused. "And then I did exactly that." The honesty in his voice filled the room. "I'm proud of the Corps I served in," he said. "But I'm also proud that the Corps continues without me." He looked at me again. "And I'm proud that someone like you is leading it now." The silence that followed was different from the one the week before. This one felt warm. Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly relieved. Margaret wiped the corner of her eye discreetly. Frank took a breath. "And if you're willing," he said, "I'd like to welcome you to this family properly." I met his gaze. "Thank you, Frank." He nodded once satisfied. Dinner continued after that. But this time the conversation was easier. Frank asked thoughtful questions about how the Corps had changed. I told him about the Marines currently serving under my command. The discipline hadn't disappeared. The standards were still high. The mission was still the same. Frank listened carefully. And every so often he nodded the way Marines do when they hear something that makes sense. After dessert, Daniel stepped outside to take a phone call. Margaret went to the kitchen. Frank and I ended up alone at the table. He leaned back slightly. "You know something," he said. "What's that?" "I spent most of my life believing leadership had a certain look." "What kind of look?" "Older, louder, probably male." I smiled faintly. "That used to be common." Frank nodded. "But after meeting you, I realized something." "What's that?" "Real leadership looks like discipline." He tapped the table gently. "And patience." I appreciated that more than he probably realized. We sat quietly for a moment. Then Frank added one more thought. "You know what the strange part is?" "What?" "If you hadn't stayed calm last Sunday, I probably would have stayed stubborn." "That happens sometimes." Frank nodded. "Turns out the most powerful kind of revenge isn't yelling." I raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "Grace." Margaret returned from the kitchen just then. "You two solving the problems of the world out here?" "Just learning a few things," Frank said. She smiled. "Well, that's progress." Later that evening, Daniel and I walked back to the car. The porch light glowed warmly behind us. Frank stood in the doorway beside Margaret. Daniel started the engine and looked at me. "That went a lot better." "Yes, it did." We drove slowly down the quiet street. And as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, I thought about how strange life can be. Sometimes people imagine revenge as something loud, something sharp, something that humiliates the other person. But after 30 years in the Marine Corps, I've learned something different. The strongest response is often the quietest one. The moment when dignity speaks louder than anger. And sometimes that moment changes people more than any argument ever could. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone who learned the hard way that respect goes both directions, then take a moment to share it with someone who might appreciate it too. And if you enjoy stories about life, family, and the lessons we keep learning even later in life, consider following along for more. Because sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't on distant fields. They happen around dinner tables. Between generations. Between pride and understanding. And when those battles end with respect instead of resentment, everyone walks away stronger.